All right, guys, welcome to the review for the study guide for Chapter 21, Sections 1 and 2. And remember, if you're using this as a whole class, pause before each item so that we can have someone share their response before we reveal the information. All right, so starting with our word list, we have the word secession. Secession, lots of S sounds there. Secession is the act of withdrawing from an organization or an alliance, and this is something that we've talked about a number of times so far this year. There were threats of secession with the Alien and Sedition Act in 1798 under President John Adams. You might remember that his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, as well as another Constitutional Convention veteran, James Madison, both from Virginia, got together because they objected to the Sedition Act and felt that it was unconstitutional because it violated which amendment, do you think? Do you remember which amendment the Sedition Act violated? Is the First Amendment. They were only able to get two states, Virginia and Kentucky, to sign on to them, but there were threats of secession then. Then, under Andrew Jackson, there was this thing called the Tariff of Abominations, a tariff of 1828. And it was that crazy tariff that taxed imported goods at a rate of over 60%. And mostly it was in the South, again, where there was a lot of objection to the tariff because Southerners relied a great deal on European imports in order to satisfy their needs, their demand for goods. So a lot of threat of secession then. That directly leads to the nullification crisis, which is a reaction to all of the stuff that's going on. It's a pretty long and drawn out situation, right? So it's basically a lot of southern states saying, we object to what you're doing with this, and we believe that we have the authority as independent states to reject or nullify your power in this particular law. And the same thing went on with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. There was this belief that because of the 10th Amendment, states' rights, that we had all, as individual states, entered into an agreement with all the other states that allowed us to form this larger government, but that also meant that we had the individual right as states to reject something that the national government was doing. This is also going to pop up when we talk about Missouri's application for statehood between 1819 and 1821, and then, shockingly, the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And here you see a political cartoon that's an example of that, right? Trying to tear apart a map of a portion of the eastern part of the United States. The map's a little bit on its side there. And the sad cow of the Union, right? And you've got these various states that want to smash up the Union and secede. You've got President Buchanan. So this is even before Lincoln shows up on the scene. And then Georgia trying to get whatever it can out of the Union, just in case something happens. All right, now on to the identification. And again, remember, if you're using this as a class, you'll want to pause here to get a response from one of our classmates before we can reveal the answers. All right, the Union. So the Union is the name that we give capital U to the United States that is a unified country under a single government. And then James Talmadge. Talmadge was a representative from New York, so he was in the Hoffer, the House of Representatives. And in 1819, he had proposed an amendment to a statehood bill for Missouri. And he said that Missouri can only become a state if it is not entered as a slave state. All right, pause here if you need to get your corrections before moving on. All right. And number 1, how and when had Congress established guidelines for the formation of new states? So this happens with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And what part of these guidelines caused a problem in 1819? It was the provision that banned slavery anywhere north of the Ohio River. Number 2, which Western states were considered free? That was Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois in the northern states. Which states were considered slaveholding or allowing slavery? That would be Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Mississippi in the South. And again, pause here if you need more time to get your corrections. Number 3, what unspoken agreement had been made about admitting new states? We've talked about this before, and it was this unspoken agreement to keep the number of free states and states allowing slavery to be equal. We wanted to keep that balance. Which state's admission upset this agreement? It was Illinois. Illinois. Make sure you make that correction. This is one that people commonly get wrong, so make sure that you correct it. Number 4, why did some Northerners question Missouri's slave status? They questioned it because Missouri is a chunk of land that is north of the place where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi River. Now, the Ohio River does not continue flowing out to the west, right, to the Pacific Ocean. It stops after a certain point. Missouri is far beyond that point. So the argument here was, well, if the Ohio, right, continued in that direction, it kind of creates this natural land boundary. And so because Missouri is north of that zone where those two rivers intersect, then Missouri should not be open to slavery. How might this impact the Louisiana Territory? So there were a lot of people that were concerned that if they allowed Missouri to kind of skirt this little guideline from the Northwest Ordinance, that there was the possibility that slavery could spread across the rest of the territories that were in that chunk of land that we bought, the Louisiana Purchase. And then that would allow a whole bunch of new slave-allowing states to form. And regardless of what other things we may think about these folks, there was in the North a lot of concern about limiting the spread of slavery. All right, and again, you'll want to pause here before we move on so you can get your corrections. Number 5, how do the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, that states' rights stuff, relate to this situation? And again, think back to that diagram we saw at the beginning as well. So Southerners believed that because Congress had limited rights, right, it didn't have the right to decide for states, if they were free states or states that allowed slavery, that also meant that it should be up to the people of each state to decide those rules for themselves. So this is a hardcore states' rights issue. It was something that territories were being allowed to decide. So, why not continue that tradition? All right, and number 6, how would the balance of power in Congress be upset if it was allowed to end slavery in Missouri? Okay, so the concern was that Congress might decide that it wanted to end slavery everywhere else. It could just take unilateral action for everybody. The North had more votes, to block this whole situation, right? The North had more votes in the Hoffer, but the Senate was split 50-50 because, right, if they kept maintaining a balance of free states and slave states, then there's going to be a 50-50. Yes, the president of the Senate, who's also the vice president of the United States, does get to be the tiebreaker, but might want to consider who the vice president was and where he might have been from. The South then would automatically lose power if Missouri became a state under these guidelines. That means they would have a lower percentage of representatives and a lower number of senators, and that was a concern for them. All right, and what were the results of the vote on the Talmadge Amendment? So there was approval for it in the Hoffer, but it was defeated in the Senate, and so that leaves us in a political deadlock. Nobody's willing to budge. And again, pause here if you need some time to make your corrections. All right, number 7. What was the solution proposed by Henry Clay? So Clay proposes what becomes called the Missouri Compromise. The idea was that you can admit Missouri as a state that permits slavery, but this other chunk of land way up in the Atlantic coast, Maine, is applying for statehood, and they can come in as a free state, which makes perfect sense because they're so far north. Then they had this additional guideline to the Missouri Compromise saying that north of 36 degrees 30 minutes, there will be no slavery ever, and that south of that line, slavery can be permitted. It's not mandatory. It's not requiring people to own other people, but it allows it to be legal to have slavery. How did Northerners and Southerners react to this compromise? So nobody was particularly happy about it, but they were willing to accept it. Northern congressmen were called traitors. Southerners hated the partial ban on slavery, but it kind of was what it was. And in a real sense, that means that the Missouri Compromise was a successful compromise. In a true compromise, and we see this mentioned in To Kill a Mockingbird when Atticus is talking with Scout about the first day of school, neither side gets everything that they want. Everybody has to give up something in order to come to an agreement. And that's what happened with the Missouri Compromise. Both sides got some of what they wanted, but neither side got everything they wanted. So if there's some crankiness, then that means compromise kind of worked out for them. All right, if you need to pause here, do so that you can get your final corrections, and then you'll want to jump over to Schoology in a bit so that you can do the quiz. Make sure that once it's time to start the quiz, that you have your packet closed because packets should not be open during quiz time. Thank you.